What if the thing you have been waiting for is not the thing that is actually changing your life? What if the door, the answer, the sign, the breakthrough, the moment you keep asking God for, is not the center of the story anymore? What if the real transformation has already begun, quietly, inside you? Maybe that is why life has felt so strange lately. Not terrible in a way you can easily explain. Not completely broken, just different. Like something inside you has shifted, but the world around you has not caught up yet. You still wake up. You still answer messages. You still do what needs to be done. You still smile when people expect you to be okay. But somewhere deep within, you know you are not moving through life the same way anymore. The things that used to excite you no longer reach you the same way. Conversations that once felt normal now feel heavy. Places you used to enjoy now drain you faster than before. You may find yourself staring at your phone, reading a message, and feeling no strength to respond. Not because you are cold, not because you do not care, but because something in you is tired of giving energy to versions of life that no longer feel honest. And maybe that has confused you, because from the outside, nothing may look dramatically different. People may still see the same face, the same voice, the same responsibilities, the same routine, but inside, something sacred and uncomfortable is happening. You are beginning to outgrow a life you once prayed to survive. You are beginning to feel the distance between who you were forced to become and who God has been quietly restoring you to be. This is why you have felt emotionally tired in ways sleep does not fix. This is why rest has not always felt like rest. This is why you can be surrounded by people and still feel strangely alone. Your soul is not asking for more noise, it is asking for truth. Your spirit is not craving another distraction, it is craving alignment. Maybe you thought you were losing motivation. Maybe you thought you were becoming weak. Maybe you thought something was wrong with you, because you cannot force yourself to enjoy what once kept you comfortable. But what if nothing is wrong with you? What if the exhaustion you feel is not a sign that you are falling apart, but a sign that an old version of you can no longer carry the weight of a life you were never meant to stay in? There comes a moment when God does not immediately change your circumstances because He is doing something deeper than changing the room around you. He is changing the person who stands inside that room. He is changing your desires. He is changing your tolerance for false peace. He is changing what you can no longer pretend is enough. And that kind of change does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it begins with silence. Sometimes it begins with a strange heaviness in your chest. Sometimes it begins when you realize you no longer want to prove yourself to people who never truly saw you. Sometimes it begins when the life you used to chase starts feeling too small for the person you are becoming. So before you assume this season is punishment, pause. Before you call this confusion, listen. Before you decide you are behind, consider this. Maybe you are not stuck. Maybe you are not lost. Maybe you are not being forgotten. Maybe the reason everything feels different is because you are different now. And maybe the breakthrough you have been waiting for is not just something God is preparing for you. Maybe the breakthrough is what God has been preparing within you. One of the hardest parts of growth is that it rarely feels like growth when you are living through it. Most people imagine transformation as something inspiring. They picture confidence replacing fear. They imagine clarity replacing confusion. They expect progress to feel exciting, motivating, and obvious. But real transformation is often much quieter than that. In fact, many of the deepest changes in your life will initially feel like loss. That is why so many people mistakenly believe they are moving backward when they are actually moving forward. Perhaps that is where you find yourself today. You look at your life and wonder why things no longer feel the same. The dreams that once consumed your attention seem less urgent now. The goals that used to motivate you do not carry the same emotional weight. The approval of certain people no longer feels as important as it once did. Even some of your old habits, routines, and ambitions feel strangely disconnected from who you are becoming. At first, this can be frightening. Because when something familiar begins to lose its grip on you, it feels like you are losing a part of yourself. But what if you are not losing yourself at all? What if you are simply shedding an identity that has become too small for your soul? Many people spend years building a version of themselves designed for survival. They learn how to avoid rejection. They learn how to keep everyone happy. They learn how to hide their wounds, suppress their emotions, and carry burdens quietly. They become experts at functioning while exhausted. And eventually, that survival version becomes so familiar that it feels like their true identity. But there comes a moment when God begins inviting you beyond survival, not through force, not through punishment, but through awakening. And awakening can feel uncomfortable, because the life that once protected you may now be limiting you. The patterns that once helped you survive may now be preventing you from becoming who you were meant to be. The relationships that once felt essential may no longer align with the direction your spirit is moving. The dreams you once chased may suddenly feel empty because they were connected to an older version of you. This is why growth often feels like grief before it feels like freedom. You are not only gaining something new, you are also releasing something old, and every release carries a certain sadness. Even when it is necessary, even when it is healthy, even when it is leading you somewhere better. Think about a tree during autumn. From a distance, it appears to be losing everything. Its leaves fall away, its branches become exposed, its beauty seems to disappear. If you judge that tree only by what you could see, you might assume it was dying. But the tree knows something the observer does not. The loss is part of the preparation. The shedding is part of the process. What appears to be decline is actually transition. And perhaps that is exactly what is happening in your life right now. You are not dying. You are not failing. You are not being left behind. You are transitioning. The old ways of thinking are falling away. The old fears are losing their authority. The old need to constantly prove yourself is beginning to weaken. And while that process may feel disorienting, it is also sacred. Because every meaningful transformation requires space. God cannot fill hands that refuse to release what they are already holding. He cannot introduce you to a new season while you are desperately clinging to the old one. Sometimes the confusion you feel is simply the space between who you were and who you are becoming. The space where certainty disappears. The space where old answers no longer work. The space where your spirit learns to trust without seeing the entire path. That space can feel lonely. It can feel frustrating. It can even feel like failure. But it is often the birthplace of your greatest growth. So if you have been wondering why everything feels unfamiliar lately, do not rush to label it as a problem. If you feel disconnected from the life you used to know, do not immediately assume something has gone wrong. And if it feels like you have lost parts of yourself along the way, consider this possibility. Maybe what you are experiencing is not the collapse of your life. Maybe it is the construction of a deeper one. Because growth often feels like loss before it feels like progress. And sometimes the very things that make you believe you are falling apart are actually the signs that you are finally becoming whole. One of the most painful experiences in any season of transformation is watching certain people slowly disappear from your life. Not through a dramatic argument, not through some great betrayal, not because they suddenly became your enemy, but simply because the connection no longer feels the same. And if you are not careful, you may interpret that loss as rejection. You may begin asking yourself difficult questions. Why does everyone seem so distant now? Why do conversations feel different? Why do I feel disconnected from people I once loved? Why does it seem like my circle keeps getting smaller? The world often gives simple answers to these questions. It tells you that everyone is jealous, that everyone betrayed you, that everyone is against you. But life is usually more complex than that. Not everyone left because they hated you. Not everyone drifted away because they wanted to hurt you. And not every ending is evidence that someone failed you. Sometimes people leave because they belong to a different chapter of your story. That does not make them bad people. It does not make you a victim. It simply means that growth changes things. Think about who you were 5 years ago. Think about the fears you carried, the dreams you pursued, the conversations that excited you, the priorities that shaped your decisions. Now compare that version of yourself to who you are becoming today. You are not the same person. How could you be? Life has taught you lessons. Pain has deepened you. Experience has changed your perspective. Faith has stretched your understanding, and growth has a way of quietly reorganizing your relationships. Sometimes the people who connected with the old version of you struggle to understand the new one, not because they are wrong, not because you are superior, but because you are no longer standing in the same place together. There was a time when certain conversations felt meaningful. Now they feel exhausting. There was a time when fitting in felt important. Now authenticity matters more. There was a time when being accepted by everyone felt necessary. Now inner peace feels more valuable than approval. These shifts can feel lonely because, while your spirit is moving forward, part of you still misses what was familiar. You miss the comfort. You miss the shared history. You miss the feeling of belonging. And there is nothing wrong with that. Grieving old seasons is part of growing through them, but sometimes we hold on too tightly to relationships that were designed for a previous version of ourselves. We try to force connections to remain exactly as they were. We keep revisiting rooms that no longer fit who we are becoming, and in doing so, we create unnecessary suffering. The truth is that every season of growth requires space for new understanding, space for new purpose, space for new relationships that reflect where your life is heading rather than where it has been. This does not mean everyone from your past must disappear. Some people will grow alongside you. Some friendships will deepen. Some relationships will become stronger than ever. But others may naturally fade. And that is not always a tragedy. Sometimes it is simply life making room for what comes next. Even Jesus experienced moments of profound loneliness. There were times when people misunderstood him, times when followers walked away, times when those closest to him could not fully understand what he carried. Yet his loneliness was not proof that he was abandoned. It was often evidence that he was walking a path others could not yet see. Perhaps the same is true for you. Perhaps this season is not about losing people. Perhaps it is about discovering who remains when performance disappears. Who remains when you stop pretending? Who remains when you stop shrinking yourself to make others comfortable? Who remains when you become honest about who you truly are? Because real connection does not require you to abandon yourself. Real connection does not demand that you stay the same forever. And real love does not disappear simply because you are growing. So, if your circle feels smaller lately, do not immediately assume something is wrong. If certain relationships are changing, do not rush to label it failure. And if loneliness has been visiting you more often than usual, remember this. Loneliness is not always a punishment. Sometimes it is the quiet space between who you were and who you are becoming. Sometimes it is the bridge God uses to carry you from one chapter into another. And sometimes the reason your world feels smaller is because your soul is preparing for something deeper than popularity, deeper than approval, and deeper than belonging. It is preparing for alignment. And alignment often begins when you finally stop trying to keep every chapter alive at the same time. When most people hear the story of Joseph, they focus on the ending. They remember the palace. They remember the promotion. They remember the moment he stood before Pharaoh and became one of the most powerful men in Egypt. And while that part of the story is remarkable, it may not be the most important part. Because if we only focus on where Joseph ended up, we miss what God was actually doing all those years before anyone saw the outcome. The real miracle was not that Joseph went from prison to palace. The real miracle was that Joseph became the kind of man who could carry the responsibility of the palace without being destroyed by it. Think about that for a moment. What would have happened if the 17-year-old Joseph had been given that level of authority immediately? The young Joseph who proudly told everyone about his dreams. The young Joseph who had not yet experienced betrayal. The young Joseph who had not yet learned humility, patience, wisdom, or dependence on God. Could he have handled that position? Could he have carried that influence? Could he have survived that level of responsibility? Perhaps not, because sometimes the greatest danger is not receiving too little. Sometimes the greatest danger is receiving too much before you are ready. That is why God often works on the person before he changes the circumstances. Joseph's brothers betrayed him. He was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, forgotten in prison, and from a human perspective, it looked like his life was moving backward. Every chapter seemed worse than the one before it. Every delay felt unfair. Every closed door appeared to be another disappointment. But what if those years were not obstacles? What if they were training? What if the prison was not simply a place Joseph was trapped? What if it was the place where Joseph was transformed? Because prison taught him patience. Betrayal taught him compassion. Responsibility in Potiphar's house taught him leadership. Isolation taught him how to hear God when no one else was listening. Disappointment taught him endurance. And little by little, the boy with a dream became a man with wisdom. That transformation could not happen overnight. It required time. It required pressure. It required experiences Joseph never would have chosen for himself. And perhaps that is the part of the story most people need to hear. Because many of us spend our lives praying for the palace. We pray for the opportunity, the relationship, the success, the breakthrough, the open door. But rarely do we pray for the character required to sustain those things. Rarely do we ask God to prepare us as deeply as He prepares our future. Yet God understands something we often forget. A blessing received before maturity can become a burden. An opportunity received before wisdom can become destruction. And a dream fulfilled before character is developed can become a trap. So when God delays something, it is not always because He is withholding it. Sometimes He is preparing you for it. Sometimes He loves you too much to give you tomorrow's assignment while you are still living with yesterday's mindset. Perhaps that is why your journey has felt slower than expected. Perhaps that is why certain doors did not open when you wanted them to. Not because God forgot you, not because you failed, but because He was building something inside you that matters more than immediate results. The world celebrates promotions. God develops people. The world measures success by outcomes. God measures success by transformation. And when you begin to see your life through that lens, everything changes. You stop asking, "Why is this taking so long?" And you begin asking, "Who am I becoming through this process?" Because the greatest miracle in Joseph's story was never the throne beside Pharaoh. The greatest miracle was the heart that emerged from the prison, a heart strong enough to carry influence wise enough to lead, compassionate enough to forgive, and humble enough to give God the glory. That was the real victory. And perhaps that is the miracle God is working in you right now. For a long time, you may have believed that the answer to your prayers existed somewhere outside of you. A new opportunity, a new relationship, a financial breakthrough, a door finally opening, a problem finally disappearing. And perhaps there is nothing wrong with hoping for those things. We all have moments when we long for relief. We all have seasons when we ask God to change something about our circumstances. But what if the thing you have been focusing on is not the most important thing happening right now? What if the greatest work of God is not taking place around you, but within you? Most people spend years waiting for a different life. Very few stop long enough to notice that they are becoming a different person, and that difference matters more than they realize. Because imagine receiving the perfect relationship while still carrying the same fears that sabotaged previous ones. Imagine receiving financial abundance while still operating from a mindset of insecurity. Imagine stepping into a major opportunity while still being controlled by the need for approval. Would the new circumstances truly change your life? Or would the old version of you eventually recreate the same struggles in a different environment? This is why God often works from the inside out. The world focuses on outcomes. God focuses on transformation. The world says, "Change my situation." God often says, "Let me change you first." And that process can be difficult to recognize because it rarely looks dramatic. It happens quietly. You begin to notice that certain things no longer trigger you the way they once did. You become less interested in proving yourself. You stop chasing validation from people who cannot give you the peace you are seeking. You become more comfortable with silence, more comfortable with honesty, more comfortable being who you truly are. These changes may seem small, but they are not small at all. They are evidence that something deeper is happening. Perhaps the reason this season feels strange is because your spirit is being prepared for a life your current mindset could not fully sustain. Sometimes God changes your capacity before He changes your circumstances. Sometimes He expands your heart before He expands your opportunities. Sometimes He teaches you peace before He gives you the thing you thought would create peace. Because true peace was never supposed to depend on the outcome. Think about the person you were several years ago. Would that version of you handle today's challenges the same way? Probably not. You have learned things, you have survived things, you have healed from things. And while you may still see your flaws, there is also wisdom in you now that did not exist before. There is strength in you now that was forged through experience. There is compassion in you now that was born from pain. There is patience in you now that came from waiting, and all of that matters. In fact, it may matter more than the very thing you have been praying for. Because one day the prayer may be answered, the opportunity may arrive, the door may open, the breakthrough may come. But when that moment arrives, what will truly determine your future is not the blessing itself. It will be the person receiving it. The blessing is important. But the person carrying the blessing is even more important. This is why some people receive everything they ever wanted and still remain unhappy. Because external success cannot heal internal emptiness. A new chapter cannot automatically create a new identity. A different environment cannot instantly transform a wounded heart. Only inner transformation can do that. And perhaps that is what God has been doing all along. Perhaps while you were watching the clock, He was shaping your character. While you were focused on the door, He was strengthening your foundation. While you were asking, "When will my life change?" He was quietly asking, "Will you allow me to change you?" That question is deeper than it appears. Because circumstances eventually come and go. Seasons rise and fall. Opportunities appear and disappear. But the person you become remains. And when God transforms a person from the inside out, that transformation cannot be taken away by a setback, a disappointment, or a delay. It becomes part of who they are. So maybe this season is not primarily about getting what you want. Maybe it is about becoming who you were created to be. Maybe the miracle is not waiting at the end of the road. Maybe the miracle is already happening with every lesson you learn, every wound that heals, every fear you release, and every step you take toward becoming more aligned with the person God always saw within you. Because sometimes God changes you before He changes your circumstances. And when He finally changes your circumstances, you realize the greatest gift was never the new chapter. The greatest gift was the new person who entered it. Perhaps one of the questions you have been asking yourself lately is this: why am I so tired? Not physically tired in the ordinary sense. Not the kind of exhaustion that disappears after a good night's sleep. Something deeper than that. A tiredness that seems to follow you even when nothing particularly difficult is happening. A heaviness that sits quietly beneath the surface. A feeling that your energy is being drained by things that never used to affect you this much. You wake up tired. You go through the day tired. You finish conversations tired. Sometimes you are not even sure what exactly is exhausting you. You simply know that something feels different. And because of that, many people immediately assume something is wrong. They tell themselves they are becoming weak. They think they are losing motivation. They wonder whether they are becoming lazy, disconnected, or emotionally unstable. But what if the exhaustion is not evidence of weakness? What if it is evidence of transformation? One thing modern psychology and spiritual growth often agree on is this: human beings can carry an identity long after it has stopped serving them. We continue playing roles that no longer fit. We continue carrying expectations that no longer align with who we are becoming. We continue forcing ourselves to survive environments that our spirit has already outgrown. And eventually, the nervous system begins to pay the price. For years, you may have carried responsibilities that required you to suppress your emotions. You learned how to stay strong, how to keep moving, how to function under pressure, how to smile while struggling, how to appear okay when you were not okay. At first, those survival strategies helped you. They protected you. They allowed you to keep going. But survival mode was never meant to become your permanent home. The nervous system was designed to move between effort and rest, between challenge and recovery, between giving and receiving. Yet many people spend years trapped in constant vigilance, always preparing, always anticipating, always carrying, always trying to manage everything. Eventually the body notices, eventually the mind notices, eventually the soul notices. And what often follows is emotional exhaustion. Not because you are weak, but because you have been strong for too long without allowing yourself to be fully human. There is another factor that many people overlook: overstimulation. Every day you are exposed to opinions, notifications, headlines, expectations, comparisons, demands, and endless noise. Your attention is constantly being pulled in different directions. Your mind rarely gets a moment of genuine stillness. Your nervous system rarely receives permission to exhale. And after enough time, even small tasks can begin to feel overwhelming. Not because the task is difficult, but because your internal system is overloaded. Spiritually, something similar can happen. Sometimes God begins calling you into a deeper level of alignment, not through louder noise, but through greater awareness. The things that once distracted you stop working. The habits that once numbed your emotions lose their power. The constant busyness that once made you feel productive begins to feel empty. And suddenly, you find yourself craving something you cannot fully explain. Silence, rest, meaning, presence. This can feel confusing because your old identity wants to keep running while your soul is asking you to slow down. Your old identity says, keep proving yourself. Your spirit says, you no longer need to. Your old identity says, work harder. Your spirit says, listen deeper. Your old identity says, carry everything. Your spirit says, release what was never yours to carry. That internal tension is exhausting, not because you are failing, but because two versions of yourself are pulling in opposite directions. One is trying to preserve who you used to be. The other is trying to become who you are meant to be. And whenever transformation begins, there is friction. There is uncertainty. There is discomfort. But there is also growth. Perhaps that is why this season feels different. Not because God has abandoned you, not because you are broken, not because you are losing your way, but because something inside you is being restructured. Your priorities are changing. Your values are changing. Your relationship with yourself is changing. And all meaningful change requires energy. So, before you criticize yourself for feeling tired, pause. Before you assume something is wrong, breathe. And before you label yourself weak, consider a different possibility. Not every exhaustion is weakness. Some exhaustion is the result of carrying an old identity for too long. And maybe the reason you feel so tired lately is not because you are falling apart. Maybe it is because your soul is finally ready to stop carrying who you no longer are. The truth is, most awakenings do not begin with a dramatic vision. They do not arrive with thunder from heaven. They do not always come with a life-changing event that instantly explains everything. More often, awakening begins quietly. So quietly, in fact, that many people mistake it for confusion. They think something is wrong because they no longer feel connected to the life they used to know. They think they are lost because the old answers no longer satisfy them. But what if those feelings are not signs that you are drifting away? What if they are signs that you are waking up? Spiritual growth rarely begins with certainty. It often begins with discomfort. It begins with the realization that something inside you is changing, even before you fully understand what that change means. And while every journey is unique, there are certain signs that often appear when a person is moving into a deeper level of awareness. The first sign is this: you no longer fit into your old life. At one time, you could move through certain environments without thinking twice. You could participate in conversations that now leave you feeling empty. You could spend time chasing things that no longer hold your attention. But recently, something has shifted. The life that once felt normal now feels strangely limiting. You try to reconnect with old versions of yourself, but it no longer works. You try to force excitement for things that used to motivate you, but the energy is gone. And perhaps that has scared you, because whenever growth begins, there is a period where the old life no longer fits, but the new life has not fully arrived. You find yourself standing between two chapters, not completely who you were, not yet who you are becoming. And that space can feel uncomfortable, but it is often where awakening begins. The second sign is this: you are beginning to value silence, not because you dislike people, not because you are becoming cold or withdrawn, but because noise no longer satisfies you the way it once did. For years, many people used distraction to avoid themselves. Constant entertainment, constant activity, constant stimulation, anything to avoid being alone with their thoughts. But awakening changes that. You begin craving moments of stillness, moments where there is no performance, no comparison, no pressure to impress anyone. You start noticing that some of your deepest insights arrive when the world becomes quiet. You discover that peace is not found in having more information. It is often found in creating more space. And in that silence, something beautiful happens. You begin hearing your own soul again. You begin recognizing what truly matters. You begin reconnecting with the voice that has been buried beneath years of noise. The third sign is perhaps the most powerful of all. You no longer feel the need to constantly prove yourself. This does not happen overnight. For many years, people live as if their worth depends on achievement. They work harder, try harder, explain themselves more, seek validation from people who may never fully understand them. Everything becomes a performance. Everything becomes an attempt to earn acceptance. But eventually something shifts. You realize how exhausting that way of living truly is. You realize that no amount of approval can create genuine peace. You realize that proving yourself is a game with no finish line. And slowly, you begin putting the burden down, not because you have stopped caring, but because you have started understanding your value. You no longer need every person to agree with you. You no longer need everyone to see your worth. You no longer need to win every argument or justify every decision. There is freedom in that. There is healing in that. There is maturity in that. And perhaps that is where you are right now. Not lost, not broken, not falling behind. Simply awakening. Awakening to the fact that growth is changing your desires. Awakening to the fact that peace matters more than performance. Awakening to the fact that your soul was never meant to spend its entire life chasing external validation. So if these signs feel familiar, do not be afraid. You are not becoming less of yourself. You are becoming more of who you truly are. And sometimes the first evidence of awakening is not that your life suddenly changes. It is that your relationship with yourself finally begins to. Surrender is one of the most misunderstood words on the spiritual journey. Many people hear it and think it means giving up. They imagine surrender as weakness, as defeat, as letting life happen without caring anymore. But true surrender is not the absence of strength. It is the moment your strength finally stops fighting what only God can carry. For so long, you may have lived with your hands tightly closed, holding the outcome, holding the timeline, holding the fear, holding the need to understand every detail before you trust the next step. And perhaps you did not do that because you lacked faith. Perhaps you did it because you were tired of being disappointed. When life hurts you enough, control begins to feel like protection. You start believing that if you can just manage everything perfectly, you will not be caught off guard again. If you can predict every outcome, you will not be broken by surprise. If you can hold everything together, maybe nothing will fall apart. But control is a heavy thing to worship. It asks for your peace. It asks for your sleep. It asks for your joy. It asks for your presence. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin surviving instead of living. That is why surrender is not about receiving a blessing first. It is about receiving peace. Peace when the answer has not arrived yet. Peace when the door is still closed. Peace when the situation has not changed. Peace when you still do not know how God is going to work it out. There is a kind of peace that only becomes possible when you stop demanding to know everything before you trust. And that peace is not passive. It is sacred. It is the quiet courage to say, God, I do not understand this, but I release my need to control what only you can see. Surrender means releasing control, not responsibility, not wisdom, not action, but the illusion that everything depends entirely on you. It means doing what you can with honesty, faith, and humility, then allowing God to handle what your hands were never meant to hold. Surrender also means releasing fear. The fear that if you stop worrying, everything will collapse. The fear that if you stop forcing, nothing will happen. The fear that if you let go, you will lose what matters most. But sometimes fear convinces you that holding on is safety, when in reality, holding on is the very thing keeping your soul exhausted. There are things you cannot heal by obsessing over them. There are people you cannot change by over-explaining yourself. There are outcomes you cannot force by replaying every possible scenario in your mind. At some point, peace begins where control ends. And maybe that is where God is gently leading you now. Not into carelessness, not into denial, but into trust. The kind of trust that breathes. The kind of trust that says, even if I do not have the answer today, I am still held. The kind of trust that does not need to panic in order to prove it cares. Surrender also means releasing expectations. This may be the hardest part, because sometimes what hurts most is not only what happened, it is what you thought would happen. The relationship you thought would last, the opportunity you thought would open, the person you thought would understand, the timeline you thought your life would follow. And when reality does not match expectation, grief enters quietly. You grieve the version of life you imagined. You grieve the future you were emotionally attached to. You grieve the answers you thought would come sooner. But surrender allows you to place even those expectations into God's hands, not because they did not matter, but because your peace matters too. You can honor what you hoped for without being imprisoned by it. You can admit that something hurt without building your entire identity around the wound. You can let go without becoming bitter. That is the holy work of surrender. It does not always change the situation immediately, but it changes the way the situation lives inside you. The burden becomes lighter, the noise becomes softer, the fear loses some of its authority, and for the first time in a long time, your soul gets room to breathe. So maybe today, surrender does not need to be dramatic. Maybe it begins with one quiet prayer. God, I release what I cannot control. Maybe it begins with unclenching your hands. Maybe it begins with admitting that you are tired of carrying what was never meant to be carried alone. Maybe it begins when you stop asking surrender to give you certainty and allow it to give you peace. Because the deepest blessing is not always getting what you wanted exactly when you wanted it. Sometimes the deepest blessing is becoming free before anything changes, free from the pressure to force, free from the fear of being forgotten, free from the expectation that your worth depends on an outcome. And when you finally surrender, you do not lose yourself. You return to yourself. You return to faith. You return to peace. You return to the quiet truth that God has been holding what your hands were too tired to carry. There comes a moment in every journey when something quietly clicks into place, not because all the questions have been answered, not because every wound has completely healed, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because, for the first time, you begin to see your story differently. You stop looking at your past as a collection of random disappointments. You stop viewing your struggles as evidence that something went wrong. You stop measuring your life only by what you lost. And slowly, almost unexpectedly, a deeper understanding begins to emerge. You realize that perhaps nothing was as meaningless as it once seemed. For years, you may have asked difficult questions. Why did that relationship end? Why did that opportunity disappear? Why did that season take so much from me? Why did I have to walk through so much loneliness? Why did God seem silent when I needed him most? At the time, there were no easy answers. There was only uncertainty, only pain, only the feeling of moving through darkness without knowing where it would lead. But awakening often changes the way you interpret your history. You begin to notice patterns you could not see before. You begin to recognize lessons hidden inside the struggles. You begin to understand that some of the experiences you once wanted erased became the very things that shaped your strength. The heartbreak taught you discernment. The waiting taught you patience. The disappointments taught you where not to place your identity. The loneliness taught you how to hear your own soul. The uncertainty taught you how to trust when certainty was unavailable. And suddenly the pieces start connecting, not perfectly, but meaningfully. You realize that God was present in places where you assumed he was absent. He was present in the closed doors, present in the delays, present in the seasons where nothing seemed to move, present in the prayers that appeared unanswered, not always changing your circumstances immediately, but quietly working within them. Perhaps that is one of the greatest awakenings a person can experience. The realization that God never abandoned them, not once. Even when they felt forgotten, even when they felt exhausted, even when they questioned everything. Looking back, moments where what felt like rejection was actually redirection. Moments where what felt like loss was actually preparation. And, as this understanding grows, something inside you softens. You stop fighting your past. You stop wishing you could erase entire chapters. You stop seeing yourself as someone who has only suffered. Instead, you begin seeing yourself as someone who has been shaped, someone who has been refined, someone who has been carried farther than they ever realized. This does not mean every painful experience was good. It does not mean every wound should have happened. But it does mean that God is capable of bringing purpose out of places that once felt empty. It means your story is bigger than your pain. It means your setbacks do not have the final word. It means your struggles were not the end of the story. And perhaps the most healing realization of all is this: nothing was wasted. Not the tears, not the waiting, not the confusion, not the setbacks, not the years that seemed lost, not even the mistakes, because every chapter taught you something. Every season shaped something. Every challenge revealed something. And every step, even the ones you never understood, helped lead you to the person you are becoming today. That is the awakening. The moment you finally realize that your story was never falling apart, it was unfolding. As we come to the end of this journey together, I want you to stop for a moment and consider something. What if the miracle you have been waiting for is not somewhere out in the future? What if it is not hidden behind another month, another year, another breakthrough, another answered prayer? What if the miracle has already begun, not around you, within you? Because, if you are honest, something has changed. Perhaps not in a way that everyone can see, perhaps not in a way that can be measured, but something inside you is different now. You are not carrying pain the same way you once did. You are not reacting to life the same way you once did. You are not chasing approval the way you once did. You are not collapsing under pressure the way you once did, and maybe you have overlooked those changes because they happened slowly. Healing rarely announces its arrival. Growth rarely asks for attention. Transformation often happens so gradually that we only recognize it when we look back. But look at yourself. Look at how much you have survived. Look at the battles you thought would destroy you. Look at the seasons you never imagined you would make it through. There was a time when certain disappointments would have completely shattered your peace. There was a time when someone else's opinion could define your entire day. There was a time when uncertainty felt unbearable. And yet here you are, still standing, still believing, still moving forward, not perfectly, but faithfully. That matters more than you realize, because healing is not becoming someone who never struggles. Healing is becoming someone who no longer believes that struggle defines them. Healing is learning that your worth remains intact, even when life feels uncertain. Healing is discovering that peace can exist alongside unanswered questions. Healing is realizing that God's presence was never dependent on your circumstances. For so long, you may have been waiting for proof that your life was changing. A sign, a door, a breakthrough, a dramatic moment that would confirm everything. But perhaps the deepest confirmation has been quietly unfolding inside your own heart. The fact that you are becoming softer instead of bitter, wiser instead of resentful, more compassionate instead of closed off, more authentic instead of performative. These are not small things. These are sacred things. These are the fingerprints of transformation. And maybe that is why this season feels different. Not because all your problems have disappeared, not because every prayer has already been answered, but because your soul is finally learning that peace was never supposed to arrive after everything was fixed. Peace was meant to accompany you while you were still becoming. So take a deep breath. Release the pressure to have everything figured out. Release the belief that you are behind. Release the fear that nothing is changing. Because something is changing. You are changing. And sometimes the most extraordinary miracles are not the ones that happen around us. They are the ones that happen within us. Maybe the miracle isn't coming. Maybe it has already started inside you. And perhaps one day you will look back on this season and realize that while you were waiting for your life to change, God was quietly healing your heart, restoring your spirit, and transforming you into someone stronger, wiser, freer, and more whole than you ever imagined possible. Before you leave, I want to share one final thought with you. You do not need to have everything figured out tonight. You do not need all the answers. You do not need to know exactly where the road ahead leads. Sometimes growth begins with something much smaller, a moment of honesty, a moment of peace, a moment where you finally stop fighting yourself. If these words felt familiar, perhaps it is because something inside you already knew them. Perhaps a part of your spirit has been trying to tell you these things for a long time. A part that knew you were not broken. A part that knew you were not falling behind. A part that knew this season was not the end of your story. And if this message brought even a little peace to your heart today, quietly leave an Amen below, not as a ritual, not because a comment changes your future, but as a simple reminder to yourself that you are choosing faith over fear, peace over pressure, and trust over endless striving. And if you are on a journey of healing, growth, self-discovery, and deeper faith, I would love for you to walk this path with us. Subscribe and become part of this community, not because we have all the answers, but because we are learning together, growing together, healing together, one step at a time. And wherever you are right now, whatever burden you may still be carrying, I hope you remember this. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. Keep going, keep growing, keep trusting. The story is still unfolding, and perhaps the most beautiful chapters are still ahead of you.